In front of the whole family, my granddaughter called me mummy and laughed. I smiled, but in that moment, something inside me died. The sound of laughter seemed to echo louder than any conversation at that dinner table. Have you ever been there? That moment when humiliation burns inside, but you can't or won't react. I was sitting in the corner, as usual, helping to serve, clearing dishes, trying not to take up too much space. Beside me, my daughter, Susan, said nothing. Not a word. She just continued cutting the meat on her plate, as if she hadn't heard. But I heard, I felt. It was as if every letter of that sentence had been hammered into me. The old woman is scary. She looks like a mummy. As I held the cutlery, my hands trembled slightly, but not from weakness. It was something else, a mixture of sadness, disappointment, and something beginning to blossom deep down. That wasn't the first comment. In fact, little jokes had been thrown around for a while, like someone throwing stones and pretending it was an accident. Are you deaf, Grandma? You don't understand these things these days. Poor thing, she's lost. Cruel ingratitude disguised as humor. I gave everything for that family. I was mother, father, counselor, nurse, seamstress, cook. I worked all night to pay for Susan's education, sold my wedding ring to fix her car, canceled doctor's appointments to buy birthday presents, and in the end, there I was, rejected, invisible, as if my story had no value. Do you understand that feeling? The feeling of being treated like an old piece of furniture, present in the house but unimportant. Conversations continued at the table. I heard stories about trips, plans, purchases. No one asked me anything. No one cared how I was doing or if I needed anything. The respect for grandparents, once the law of the land, seemed to have vanished. I looked at my granddaughter, Lily, who was still laughing with her phone in her hand, telling someone about the joke she'd made on me. In that moment, I realized it wasn't just about me. It was about everything we were losing as a family. That I cut the bread to serve. My memories came rushing back like a movie. I saw little Susan, feverish, lying in my lap. I remembered running to school when she fell at recess, the joy of the day she received her diploma. And now, all of that seemed meaningless, a legacy of love, effort, and sacrifice, erased by a cruel laugh. I could have lowered my head. I could have gotten up and walked away. I could have swallowed it once more, like I always did. But in that moment, something shifted. It was as if a different weight had fallen on me, not a weight that knocked me down, but one that kept me standing. I looked at every face at the table. Some laughed, others avoided my gaze. Everyone seemed comfortable with the scene, and that's when I understood. I was no longer the silent, accepting grandmother. Something inside me was ready to awaken. But it's curious how certain decisions begin almost imperceptibly. A simple glance, a longer silence, a firmer handshake. That's how, at that dinner, amid the clatter of cutlery and laughter, my story began to change. I'm Eleanor Grace, 74 years old. I've lived a long life, but I still had stories to tell. They just didn't want to hear them. On the surface, my life seemed peaceful. I woke up early every day, watered the plants on the balcony, and tidied the kitchen before the sun even rose. There was an almost sacred ritual in the smell of tea in the morning, the sound of the kettle whistling, the sound of the pages of an old book flipping through while I waited for the water to boil. Small gestures that, to me, carried decades of meaning. To them, it was just old lady stuff. In the living room, my favorite chair was near the window. From there, I could see the neighborhood children heading to school, mothers hurriedly carrying bags, neighbors waving with shy smiles. I've always been good at noticing the details no one else notices. Perhaps because life has taught me to find beauty in the simple things, even when the world around me seems indifferent. I sewed for hours, not out of necessity, but because each stitch felt like a piece of history being preserved. My mother taught me how to hold a needle as a child, and that knowledge became an extension of who I was. Many of the clothes my daughter wore in her youth came from those hands. Today, they prefer expensive stores, fabrics that tear easily and hold no memory. Behind this calm routine lay a heavy silence. The house was always full of voices, but rarely did anyone speak to me. I was present at Sunday lunches, birthday parties, Christmases, serving, cleaning, caring. It was almost as if my existence were a backdrop. They were living their own story, and I just watched. However, don't think my life has always been this way. There was a time when I was the center of decision making. The house only ran because I held the fort. I took care of the bills, managed what little we had, settled arguments, negotiated debts. I had a voice, and that voice was heard. But over time, I realized that when you give too much of yourself, people start to think it's an obligation. And when you stop, they rebel. I had plans, small dreams, but they were my own. I wanted to see the coast, learn to paint, plant my own garden. But there was always something more pressing: Susan's college, the car repairs, the rent arrears. And so, year after year, I put my desires in the back of an imaginary drawer, the one that would never be opened again. What no one knew was that, beneath the discreet smile and tied-back hair, lay a woman who had learned to observe and wait. I overheard half-hearted conversations, caught shifts in tone of voice, saw exchanged glances when they thought I wasn't paying attention. I learned to recognize when something wasn't being said, when there was a hidden truth behind kind words. There were moments when I felt proud of what I'd built. But there was also that bitter taste, a mixture of frustration and exhaustion. It wasn't just the lack of recognition. It was the silent impact this indifference had on me, as if, little by little, I were disappearing. Despite this, there was a quiet force that wouldn't abandon me. Perhaps it was the same one that had kept me facing loss, surviving difficult times, and raising a daughter practically alone. I knew that transformation doesn't happen overnight. It begins as a whisper, a nagging feeling that slowly grows until it becomes impossible to ignore. And even with all that seemingly peaceful routine, the plants, the sewing, I felt something was changing. Small signs, details that only I noticed. It wasn't just about being treated with disrespect. It was about a shift in mindset. I was beginning to remember who I was before I became just the grandmother. As I slowly stirred the tea in my cup, I thought about how people get used to someone's presence until they think it's permanent. But nothing is permanent. One decision, no matter how small, can change the course of everything. And at that point in my journey, a decision was already being made, even if they didn't know it yet. Sunday dinner has always been, for me, a nearly unbreakable ritual. The table set with a white tablecloth that had seen decades of family gatherings, the china only brought out of the cupboard on special occasions, the smell of roasting wafting through the house. It was the kind of setting that, years ago, brought comfort. Today, however, it carries something different. A weight, a certain silence that isn't an absence of sound, but of connection. 16-year-old Lily sits on the corner of the table, cell phone in hand, her posture relaxed, as if nothing there is worthy of attention. She rarely participates in conversations, but when she does, it's to make a quick comment, almost always with a hint of sarcasm. That day, as I passed her plate of potatoes, she looked up, stared at me for a few seconds, and with a wry smile, said, "The old woman is scary. She looks like a mummy." Her laugh came quickly, almost like a reflex. What surprised me was the sound of other laughter mingling, filling the space. Some pretended not to hear, but it wasn't long before the knowing glances revealed that everyone had understood. I instinctively lowered my head, as if that could somehow protect me. But inside, I felt the impact. It was as if an invisible line had been crossed. Susan, my daughter, said nothing. Not even a disapproving look at her own daughter. She continued cutting the meat, chewing slowly, as if the sentence had no meaning. Her silence hurt me more than Lily's words, because it wasn't just omission, it was consent. As I chewed slowly, I observed every gesture, every expression, like someone watching from backstage at a play in which they no longer have a role. I noticed small signs that, before, I might have ignored, the way they talked among themselves without including me. The rush to close the conversation when I entered the room, the lack of questions about my life, these were details that, taken together, formed a clear picture. I was becoming a secondary character in my own family. What many don't realize is that humiliation rarely begins with a grand act. It builds in layers, almost imperceptibly, until it becomes impossible to ignore. In my case, it seeped into jokes that no one responded to, invitations that stopped coming, and the constant feeling that I was taking up too much space. I continued serving the food, smiling slightly, but inside, something stirred. It wasn't pure anger, it was something more complex, a mixture of sadness and the beginnings of clarity. That night made me realize that things weren't just changing, they had been changing for a long time. I remembered a phrase I'd heard years ago, respect isn't lost all at once, it's ripped away in pieces. At that dinner, I felt as if another piece had been taken from me. And at the same time, I realized I had a limit. Maybe I'd been too slow to recognize it, but it was there, staring me in the face, as clear as the sound of Lily's voice. As conversations resumed, I let my eyes wander around the table. I saw Susan talking about a new project at work, Lily laughing at something on her phone, other family members chatting about trivialities. It was as if I were invisible. Only this time, this invisibility wasn't silently accepted within me. The journey I'd been on until then of discreet presence, of infinite patience, of waiting for affection to be spontaneous, was beginning to give way to something else, a shift in mindset from which there was no turning back. I realized that this seemingly banal scene for them would be a turning point for me, because these aren't just words thrown into the wind, they have an impact. They shape how we are seen and, often, how we come to see ourselves. And I knew, with an almost uncomfortable clarity, that something inside me would no longer accept being shaped that way. I remained there, participating in the dinner as if nothing had happened, but internally cataloging every expression, every silence, every omission. It was as if I were putting together pieces of a puzzle, watching the final image begin to emerge. And deep down, I knew that once that image was complete, there would be no going back to the way it was before. I pretended nothing had happened. I reached over, served Lily some more potatoes, arranged the roast in the center of the table, and forced a small smile, as if her comment had been just a light joke. On the outside, I looked the same as always, calm, present, busy making sure everyone was well served. But inside, something had already changed. It wasn't a sudden break. It wasn't an explosion. It was more like gently closing a door that had always been open. I continued distributing the food, collecting empty plates, swapping dirty napkins for clean ones. No one noticed, but at that moment, I was already withdrawing emotionally. The space I'd previously filled with affection and attention was now beginning to empty. And I watched everything from the outside, as if I were a spectator at a show that no longer belonged to me. It was like being backstage, watching the lights come on, but no longer wanting to be on stage. I knew that in situations like this, the easiest thing to do would be to react with anger, but I decided otherwise. Silence is sometimes more revealing than any words. I felt that if I remained calm, I could see more clearly the hidden truth behind the gestures, the words, even the omissions. And this clarity would be essential to understanding what was really happening. As I poured more juice into Susan's glass, I noticed she wasn't even looking me in the eye. She was chatting with someone else nearby, smiling, as if I were just another person at the table, without any real importance. It was then that I understood the weight of that distance that had been growing for years. The journey that brought me here was full of decisions I'd made, believing they were for the good of all, giving up dreams, postponing desires, remaining silent in the face of small injustices. And now, all of that seemed to have become invisible. I felt a pang in my chest, but it wasn't pure sadness. It was the realization that I no longer needed to fight to hold on to a place that wasn't offered wholeheartedly. Perhaps the transformation that was beginning within me wasn't about gaining recognition, but about freeing myself from the need for it. It was as if a part of me was saying, "You've done what you had to do. Now, it's time to look at yourself." As I cut another slice of bread, I watched Lily laughing at something on her phone. She glanced at me briefly, but this time didn't say anything. Still, her gaze held that same youthful superiority, as if life were her exclusive stage and everyone else was there just to applaud. Susan, for her part, seemed oblivious to it all. Or perhaps she chose not to see. This kind of choice to overlook the obvious is one of the most bitter revelations one can have about someone close to them. An inner silence was settling within me, a place where external voices no longer penetrated, a refuge. And in that space, I began to mentally revisit past moments, small situations where I noticed the same pattern, decisions being made without consulting me, disrespectful comments treated as jokes, and that constant feeling of always giving more than I received. The impact of this wasn't immediate, but accumulated over the years, until it became impossible to ignore. I kept smiling, continuing the expected role of hostess, but my every gesture carried a new meaning. I was no longer trying to please. I was no longer seeking approval. Each dish served, each piece of cutlery arranged was, in fact, a way of mentally marking how much that space no longer defined me. And it was there, amid laughter that didn't include me in conversations that passed me by without touching me, that I realized something fundamental. True change in mindset doesn't begin when you confront the other person, but when you stop needing them to change. This is the silent decision that opens doors to a different path, a path that night began to form before me. Even if they didn't realize it, I stood firm, doing exactly what was expected of me, but with a gaze that was no longer the same. Behind it lay a plan still undefined, a seed of action planted in fertile soil. And as I collected the last dishes, I knew that this internal distance I had built would be the ground where something new and, perhaps, irreversible would begin to grow. I traded my dreams for theirs, and today, they call me a mummy. That phrase echoes within me as if it had been said 1,000 times, even if it was only once. Perhaps because, deep down, it didn't come alone. It carried with it all the other times I'd been diminished, ignored, and pushed aside. It was as if, suddenly, all the sacrifices of a lifetime had been erased with a simple comment, said with laughter. I remember long nights, sitting at my sewing machine, the repetitive sound of the needle moving in and out of the fabric marking the rhythm of my early mornings. While the neighborhood slept, I was there, transforming yards of fabric into dresses I never wore, uniforms that weren't mine, curtains for houses I'd never visit, all to save enough to pay for Susan's college education. I kept the money in envelopes, my careful handwriting marking each note's destination, tuition, books, transportation. Each envelope was a piece of me I was giving away. There were times when I saw a pretty dress in the window and wanted to go in, try it on, and treat myself, but there was always something more pressing. The refrigerator needed fixing, the electric bill was overdue, Susan needed new shoes for her internship, and I told myself I still had time to take care of myself. That time never came. I remember one particularly harsh winter. My coat was already worn, the lining fraying, but I decided to buy a warmer one for Susan. She took the bus early, braved the icy streets, and I wanted her to be protected. Me, well, I huddled in my old coat and said the cold didn't bother me that much. I was lying to her, but I was also lying to myself. This constant choice to put others first didn't seem like a sacrifice to me at the time. It was love. It was what a mother did. At least, that's what I believed. But love, when unrecognized or unappreciated, begins to create small cracks. And over time, these cracks become fissures. Today, looking back, I realize that my journey has always been marked by this limitless surrender. And it was precisely this that left me vulnerable to the kind of injustice I was now experiencing. At dinner that night, as I poured more wine for a guest, I couldn't help but think of the contrast. There I was, the same woman who had once gone out of her way to ensure the future of everyone at that table, being treated as a background figure, voiceless and unimportant. The hidden truth, which no one said out loud, was that I was no longer needed. And for many, when you're no longer needed, you cease to exist. The emotional distance that had been growing inside me began to transform into something else. It wasn't just sadness. It was a kind of clarity that comes when you finally see the bigger picture. I could see the pieces of the puzzle, the silent ingratitude, the glances that passed me by without seeing me, the jokes that passed as harmless banter. All together, they painted a picture of a reality I hadn't wanted to admit, but which was now staring me in the face. In the background of my mind, something began to take shape. It wasn't a plan yet, but an alignment of thoughts, memories, and small decisions that, together, pointed to an inevitable path. And that path didn't involve remaining the same Eleanor they knew. The transformation had already begun, even if no one there could perceive it. As I collected plates and glasses, I remembered another early morning, when, exhausted, I finished a wedding dress for delivery the next day. The payment from that job went directly to cover an overdue college tuition. I didn't tell Susan I was in the red. She never knew. And maybe you never care to know. But I knew, and because I knew, that memory burned brighter inside me. Deep down, I understood that this story wasn't just about harsh words. It was about years of imbalance, about a lack of recognition, about a cycle that repeated itself because I, somehow, had allowed it. And in that moment, as the voices around me continued to discuss trivial matters, I realized that this permission was about to end. I didn't know exactly what would come next, but I knew I couldn't stay in the same place. playing the same role, waiting for things to change on their own. And so, in the silence of that night, between the memories of the past and the discomfort of the present, something inside me began to shift definitively. That as the days passed, the once sporadic coldness became an almost constant atmosphere within that house. Conversations were quick, matter-of-fact, with no room for opinion or affection. When Susan spoke to me, her voice carried the neutrality of someone fulfilling a formality. And Lily, well, her adolescence seemed to have given her license for any trace of respect to be replaced by indifference or irony. It was as if, little by little, I had ceased to be a person and become a propolois there, but with no real function. The most painful thing wasn't the silence, but the small actions that revealed the hidden truth: family gatherings happening without my notice, important decisions being made without even a consultation. One day, I overheard Susan discussing the sale of land that was in my name, as if it were just another transaction. There were no questions, no conversation. It was as if my signature was already guaranteed, as if my will was no longer a relevant factor. This exclusion didn't happen explosively, but through a calculated sequence of gestures and omissions. Comments about what's best for everyone always seemed to exclude what might be best for me. It was total control, disguised as care. Phrases like, "let me handle it," or "don't worry about it" sounded, at first glance, like protection. But deep down they were a way to keep me out of the decision-making process. One afternoon, Lily asked me, with an almost challenging smile, if I truly understood how online banking worked. The question wasn't innocent. Soon after, I discovered that my account was linked to an app on her phone to make things easier. Make things easier for whom? It was at that moment that I realized the veiled threats weren't just words, but also actions disguised as help. I was aware of the emotional impact of this. It wasn't just about losing a voice in decision-making, but about feeling my autonomy slowly being undermined. A kind of emotional imprisonment that left no visible marks but corroded from within. The kind of prison where there are no bars, just a set of doors that slowly close until you realize there's no way out. Behind the facade of family life, a behind-the-scenes game was underway. Susan had always been practical, but now that practicality seemed too sharp, as if every gesture were calculated to keep me in a specific place. And Lily, following her mother's example, assumed an almost complicit role in this process. They exchanged looks that said more than words, a silent communication that left me out, but which made it clear that something was being built down. I wasn't a part of it. This kind of dynamic forces you to rethink every decision. The transformation that was beginning within me was fueled by these daily revelations. I no longer reacted to comments, but recorded everything. Like someone building a mental archive, I mentally noted the dates, the conversations, the subtle changes in how I was treated. It wasn't paranoia. It was the acute realization that, to maintain my sanity and autonomy, I needed to understand the bigger picture before acting. I still served coffee in the morning, still tended the plants, still moved around the house as usual, but deep down, my mindset had already shifted. Every gesture of apparent normalcy was also an act of silent observation. I was learning that sometimes the best way to confront invisible control is to let the one wielding it believe it works. And so, even surrounded by conversations that ignored me and decisions that overrode me, I maintained a firm foothold within myself, an untouched space where I could think clearly and prepare for what would come next. I knew the game they were playing depended on my passivity. And the irony is that this very apparent passivity was giving me time to see everything, to calmly decide what my next move would be. That day, I realized they didn't know my story, so they weren't entitled to my happy ending. It was as if a veil had suddenly fallen from my eyes. Everything that had previously seemed like discomfort took on clearer, more defined contours. It wasn't just about disrespect or coldness. It was about the appropriation of my life, as if my existence were merely a convenient extension to serve their interests. And in that moment, I knew that if I wanted to reclaim anything of myself, I would have to act. The decision didn't come with a fiery speech or an outburst of anger. It came quietly, like almost all major changes in my life. I learned that real transformation rarely happens with applause. It happens behind the scenes, in quiet conversations, in the choices we make, when no one is looking. And that's exactly what I started doing. The next day, while sweeping the porch, I saw Mark, my neighbor, mowing the garden. He was always kind, one of those men who greets with a smile and takes the time to listen. I walked up to the fence and, almost casually, struck up a conversation. We started talking about the weather, the plants, the street noise, but as the words flowed, I realized he was genuinely paying attention, a rarity these days, so I lowered my tone and mentioned that I'd been thinking about making some decisions about my house and belongings. I didn't elaborate, I just let it slip that maybe it was time to change certain things, to reevaluate who I wanted to leave, what I'd built to. He raised his eyebrows, but didn't ask any invasive questions. He just said, "I understand. These decisions need to be made calmly and with your heart in the right place." Those words echoed within me all day. Over the next few days, I sought out small opportunities to continue the conversation, always discreetly, out of Susan and Lily's hearing. While they believed I was busy with my usual tasks, I was actually reorganizing my thoughts and lining up my next steps. This was my rescue, not a return to the past, but the regaining of my autonomy. It was curious to notice how, once I decided to take action, I began to see every movement within the house more clearly. The niceties I'd previously accepted as care now felt like attempts to maintain control. The questions about my schedule, the suggestions that I get more rest, the offers to take care of my bills, everything took on a different meaning. It was like watching a play whose plot you finally understand. I was no longer trapped in that narrative. I was writing my own, and for the first time in a long time, I felt a spark of hope in my chest. It wasn't euphoria, it was something deeper, the feeling of regaining control, even if slowly and carefully. Each meeting with Mark became more valuable. He told me stories of people who made important decisions at the end of their lives, not out of revenge, but out of personal justice. It made me think about the impact our final choices have, not only on us, but on those who remain. And in my case, this decision carried something even more powerful, the opportunity to show that I wasn't just the supporting character they believed they had shaped. As the plan took shape within me, I continued to play my role perfectly. I served dinner, participated in conversations, and listened without interrupting. But internally, there was no longer a submission-only strategy. It was as if every dish washed, every cup of tea served, was part of a disguise that allowed me time to act at the right moment. The strangest thing is that as I approached this turning point, I began to feel a peace I hadn't felt in years, not because things around me had changed, Susan and Lily remained the same, but because I knew that this time, the story would end differently. And this time, I would be the one to choose the words of the final chapter. The morning I decided to visit the Thompsons, the sky was overcast, and a cold breeze cut through the air. I carried a basket of bread and fruit I'd prepared earlier that morning, as I used to do when I wanted to please someone. But this time, it wasn't an automatic gesture, but part of something much larger that was forming inside me. The drive to their trailer was short, but each step felt like a silent confirmation that I was on the right path. When I arrived, the children rushed to greet me with that pure enthusiasm. Only those who haven't yet experienced the world's wickedness can have their eyes shown, not because I had brought anything, but because I had appeared. That welcome touched me in a way that's hard to explain. It was a stark contrast to what I experienced at home there. My every gesture was met with coldness, as if it were an obligation. Here, it was met with genuine gratitude. Mrs. Thompson invited me in. The space was small, but there was warmth. The simple walls, decorated with children's drawings, said more about love and unity than any mansion could. Over coffee, we talked about life, about the challenges of raising children in difficult times, about how sometimes what little you have is enough when you're surrounded by true affection. As I listened, my mind raced through a silent series of memories and decisions. The hidden truth that had been revealing itself to me over the past few months was that I had built my entire life around an ideal of family that no longer existed, or perhaps had never existed. The journey up to that point showed me that, to begin anew, it wasn't necessary to erase the past, but rather to redirect the future into hands that truly knew how to care for it. I watched the children playing in the yard, running barefoot through the wet grass. Their laughter wasn't just childish noise, it was living proof that joy can exist even in simple circumstances. and it gave me a kind of clarity you can't find in books or advice. I realized my plan wasn't about taking something from someone, but about giving it to someone who could transform it into something greater. With every minute that passed, the decision gained more weight and meaning. It wasn't about revenge, but about redemption, reclaiming values, dignity, a legacy that deserved to be passed on without being lost in coldness and ingratitude. The conversations with Mark had planted the seed, but being with the Thompsons was like watering and watching something new blossom, something that connected me to the woman I used to be, the one who believed that good deeds would come back, one way or another. Mrs. Thompson, unaware of what was going on in my mind, thanked me repeatedly for the simple gesture of visiting. She said that hardly anyone ever came, and that the presence of someone to listen and share stories was a rare gift. I smiled, but inside, the idea that had been maturing took on a more definitive form. Perhaps it was time to ensure that, when my story came to an end, it wouldn't be remembered for silences and omissions, but for decisions that had a real impact. As I stood to leave, one of the children ran up to me and placed a smooth stone, painted blue, in my hand. "For you to remember me by," she said. I held that small memento like a treasure, not for the stone itself, but for the meaning of receiving something given from the heart, expecting nothing in return. I walked back home with the stone in my pocket and a small smile on my face. There was no rush. The plan required precision, timing, and silence. But I knew that from that day forward, every step would be directed toward transforming that idea into concrete action. What lay ahead could not yet be revealed, but deep inside me, it was already impossible to turn back. The room was crowded that Sunday. Susan had invited everyone to a special lunch, and the table was set with more care than usual. A new tablecloth, silverware lined up, plates gleaming in the light streaming in through the window. Fresh flowers were centered, exuding a faint scent, almost as if trying to mask the scent of tension that hung in the air. Apparently, it was a day to celebrate something, but for me, the setting was simply the perfect stage for what was to come. I settled into my usual seat, on the right side of the table, and took in every detail, the exchanged glances, the rush to serve the food, the nervousness disguised as small talk. As everyone served themselves, I maintained a serene expression. It was curious how, in those moments, silence could have more impact than any words. I waited until everyone was seated, chewing absently, before putting down my fork and wiping my lips with my napkin. Then, in a calm but firm voice, I said, "I wanted to take advantage of the fact that everyone is here to share a decision I made." The sound of silverware clanging stopped almost immediately. Susan raised her eyebrows. Lily crossed her arms, her gaze sharp, almost challenging. I continued unhurriedly. I spent many years believing that family was just blood, that love and respect came automatically with the title. But I've learned, lately, that this isn't true. And so I decided to donate my home to someone who will remember me with affection, not contempt. For a moment, no one reacted. It was as if the air had been sucked from the room. The silence stretched thickly until Susan burst out, "What? Are you crazy? This house is ours. It was always the plan." She stood, gesturing, her voice thick with disbelief and anger. Lily, beside her, paled, as if the words had struck something she believed untouchable. The defiant expression she always wore on her face vanished, replaced by a quiet, uneasy fear. I stood my ground, firm. Then, as if it were merely a formality, Mark walked through the living room door. He carried a worn but impeccably organized leather briefcase. "The papers are already signed," he said calmly. The impact was immediate. Susan looked at him, as if trying to figure out if this was a joke. Lily clutched her napkin in her hands, her eyes welling up, but said nothing. The weight of the revelation filled the room with an almost palpable discomfort, as if everyone felt the ground shift beneath their feet. I continued, without raising my tone, "This isn't about punishment, it's about decisions. I've spent my life making decisions, thinking about what's best for you. Now, this decision is mine." The silence that followed was different from the first. It was no longer one of shock, but of recognition. Words didn't need to be spoken. Everyone knew something had changed. The invisible hierarchy that governed that house had just crumbled, and no one knew how to rebuild it. I watched Susan try to articulate something, but the words wouldn't come. Lily lowered her gaze, as if avoiding facing what this decision represented. Mark, standing beside me, maintained a neutral posture. but his gaze said he understood the depth of this moment and perhaps even approved. It was strange to feel such intense peace in the midst of a tense scene. There were no shouts coming from me, no accusations, just the realization of a truth that had been building for months. I had reclaimed my voice, and it didn't ask for permission to exist. As I rose from the table, I could feel the eyes following me, not with the same indifference as before, but with a mixture of surprise, respect, and perhaps regret. I picked up my teacup and went to the window. Outside, the sun was beginning to break through the clouds, illuminating the street as if heralding something new. I didn't need to say anything else. What needed to be understood was already clear. And in that moment, I realized that the real confrontation wasn't with them, but with the version of myself that had accepted living in silence for so long. That version, finally, was behind me. The kettle whistled softly, breaking the silence that filled the small kitchen. My new home lacked the spaciousness, polished furniture, or spotless walls of my old one. The windows were simple, and the floor creaked slightly as I walked, but there was something there I hadn't felt in a long time: peace. I poured the hot water over the tea leaves and watched the steam rise, as if carrying with it all the remnants of tension that had previously suffocated me. I sat at the table, cup in hand, letting the warmth warm my fingers. Within sight, a small wooden box held some old photos. I opened it slowly, as if approaching a treasure chest of memories that can bring both comfort and pain. In one of the photos, Susan was a child, smiling in a dress I had sewn myself. I remembered the early mornings I'd stayed awake sewing in the dim light, listening to her calm breathing in the next room. Another portrait showed Lily, still a baby, in my arms, with those big eyes that once looked at me with curiosity and tenderness. That at the bottom of the box was a faded photo of myself, young, standing next to the house that no longer belonged to me. I looked at that image and realized that the woman smiling there had made silent promises to protect, to care, to never fail. And, in a way, I kept each of them. But what I've learned is that promises don't mean giving yourself away to the point of losing your very essence. I took a sip of tea and let the taste spread through my mouth. It was as if that moment were a summary of my entire recent journey, simple, yet charged with meaning. I don't regret the decision. It was painful, yes, but necessary. For many years, I thought that keeping things as they were was the only way to preserve some harmony. Today, I understand that silence can be as destructive as any open conflict. That as I looked through the photos, I realized that what I gave away wasn't just a house, it was walls, furniture, an address. But what I took with me, no one could take away. The story I built, the value of each sacrifice, the certainty that my life isn't limited to how I was treated in the end. The transformation I experienced didn't happen suddenly. It was a series of small moments, cutting phrases, and cold gestures that slowly shaped an irreversible decision. And yet, it wasn't motivated solely by pain. It was also an act of self-preservation, a way of protecting the part of me that still believes in the return of justice. I thought about the Thompsons, the children running barefoot, the genuine smiles that greeted me that day. Knowing they would now have a solid home, where good memories would be created, gave me a sense of purpose I hadn't felt in a long time. More than a roof over my head, I gave them a foundation, something I knew, from experience, could change the course of an entire life. I put the photos back away, carefully closing the box. The cup, now nearly empty, still gave off a wisp of steam. And as I glanced out the window, I saw the sun slanting toward the late afternoon. The golden light softly illuminated the room, and I realized there was no room for regret. What I'd lost in luxury, I'd gained in freedom. What I'd left behind, I'd transformed into something that restored my dignity. I stood up, walking slowly around the room. I touched the bookshelf, where now rested only a few books, a vase of fresh flowers, and that small blue-painted stone I'd received from one of the children. I placed the stone on the box of photos and smiled, feeling that these two, past and the present, could finally coexist without canceling each other out. Those who forget history lose the right to a happy ending, I thought, repeating the phrase as a reminder, not just for myself, but for everyone who might one day cross my path. Respecting those who built the ground you walk on isn't just a gesture of gratitude, it's recognizing that without those stories, the path itself might not even exist. The tea was already cold when I realized I was still standing, staring at the rock and the photos. I felt no rush to do anything else. Some silences, I discovered, are more powerful than any speech. And in that silence, life seemed, for the first time in a long time, exactly as it should be. If you've stuck with me this far, you already know this wasn't just a story about a house or a difficult decision. It was about reclaiming your own voice, about transforming pain into something meaningful. And if, in any way, this journey spoke to you, leave this quote in the comments. I'm with you until the end. It will be my way of knowing that we walked together until the last minute. Subscribe to the channel to continue following stories that provoke, move, and perhaps even change the way you see certain things. And if this video touched you, please leave a like, not just because it's an automatic gesture, but because it helps keep this conversation alive and reach those who also need to hear it. There's a video right here that complements this topic very well. Click it and continue with me there. I think you'll understand exactly why it's the perfect continuation of this conversation we started today.